Hello, this is Christian Idealism. Today we're just going to be having a short discussion on free will, and here I have Alan. Um, and so, yeah, we're going to be just discussing how there seems to be free will in the brain. At least that's where the evidence is pointing. And so, yeah. So, Alan, I want to talk to you about Peter Tice's model. I'm sure you've heard of it, haven't you?
Yes.
So what would be his he has this weird way of explaining this causality between it's not determinism, it's not randomness, it's like this criterial causation. Um, what would be how would that work? If you could just briefly explain it.
Um, you a lot of times you'll see people build a dichotomy. There's terms that will be used like they'll say, well, that's either random, which would I guess we could use stochastic, or it's determined. And when they describe determined, the word determined means bottom up. There's a cause and effect. There's A, B, C in constant sequence, and there would be the impossibility to escape this bottom upness. But the brain will take. Let me go back. If you're going to look at determination, you now are. If we're just dealing with the brain, we've got particles doing things. And you would have to divide those particles' behavior into two different classes. You would define them as dependent as one class and independent as another. An independent particle is a dumb particle. It's not been assigned any type of value. It's not being used for any other purpose. Then it's a bottom up. And that particle, let's say, could just be banging around, and there it is. Now, if the brain will harness a particle as a value, it's going to start using it as a way to store information and hold things and compare things. Now we're using particles to encrypt and encode. So it's now become, instead of let's talk about in a pathway standpoint, a particle has an independent particle has a pathway. That is the pathway through phase space. There's blah, 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 there it's knocking through. But now a dependent particle has two pathways. It has its physical pathway, but also has its informational pathway. It's been assigned a job, and that job often will be decision making. So it's now being used. It's now being used as information, like something that it starts escaping Laplacian. So if you were to think of like a neuron as a phone, let's say, I think C uses this example. A phone would have a password on it. So you have all this potential information inside of the phone, but until you meet that password, the information inside of the phone cannot pass on. So we have to, when we think about this model of determinism, we don't have a dichotomy. There are things that are random. The brain does not use randomness to make important decisions. It uses what would be called, what is the term for that? It would be, you'd basically say that it's exploiting or employing determinism. And that breaks the dichotomy. You have a brain that is determined, but it uses determination to make free decisions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I know Peter Tice, I know he's a materialist, and some people would say that you can't really have materialism and libertarian free will coexist, but he seems to think it does, and he explains it of how neurons will have this criteria before they can actually fire, that they have to meet a certain criteria, and that criteria would be determined basically by the agent's choice. So he has like two different types of free will. So he has just type 1 free will and then type 2 free will, which is type 2 free will would be like the meta free will, or
well, I believe the meta. Let's go back to let's read. He uses a water falling down rocks illustration. Have you heard that one?
Yeah, I've only watched just a few of
Okay, I've got it in my notes, so I'll read it. This is using water as an example of the two types of determinism. Independent would be like water falling down rocks. The rocks are not placing filtered constraints on the water. The system could be described as Laplacian, A plus B plus C. So you just have rocks and water, and whatever happens, happens. Dependent, this is comparing independent versus dependent. Dependent would be as if the water's input had decoding filters placed on it into a broader system. And the water's inputs futures are, wait, I'm reading that wrong. The water's inputs future is modified via filters from the rocks. So now you have an interplay between, the water has, inputs set to it, and the rocks are modifying that. The A plus B equals C stops when both physical and informational pathways are required. Changes in the physical system's criteria, parentheses, volitional attention, aka consciousness, limit firing in light that they must be met by future inputs to continue on following down these rocks, but guided by the criteria. So in one system, you just have nature, rocks and water interacting. In another, you have portions of this, let's picture a waterfall, where some water is told, hey, can you stop for a minute? We're doing something. And then another set of waterfall, rocks and water combinations are processing something. And then it gives the go ahead for that water to come down another foot. And then it's told pause. And it's not acting like nature at all anymore, especially if you think about there's now an agency placed into this waterfall where the waterfall is trying to figure something out, and not just figure something out in the present. It may be planning something that's a future state. So it could be preparing what's called a navigation, where it's comparing, if I go here, XX will happen over a specific phase, and if I go here, that will happen over phase. Now we're going to look at the layouts of these two decisions as they progress through time, the cost benefits, and what new criteria I'll encounter upon that navigation. So this is very not Laplacian. We have rocks placing, blocks on water needing to pause. So that's his general idea, is that, and all this is determined. I mean, you still have particles in a physical system doing processes, but they are now being constrained and encrypted. I like the word encrypted. He'll use parameterized or parametrized. I believe the word is the same. He wants people to start thinking of the brain as not just this system tumbling through space, but it is encrypting and also processing decisions that have future impact. So you've really escaped any kind of Laplacian domain that way.
Well, it's because the assumption of hard determinism is that the brain is literally just like this Newtonian machine that just cause and effect, that that consciousness would basically just have no control whatsoever over what goes on, and so you would have free will in that sense. But I guess what Peter Tycey's arguing is that that the brain is not this doesn't follow Newtonian determinism, but actually follows this criteria that would basically be compatible with a libertarian sense of free will.
Yeah, and he's very into volitional attention. You'll hear stand-in terms like spotlight. Have you heard of the word spotlight?
Yeah.
Before? Yeah, it's generally you do have what's called preconscious operations going on. So let's try to create a meat machine, and let's say that this meat machine has temperature sensors, proximity switches. It's dealing with tilt, gravity, wind direction. So it's got all these things. It's seeing, taking in imagery and processing and IDing it. So we can be on the bottom end a meat machine that's just taking in what's Rabinovich, that's another guy we might talk about someday, is got this thing called chunking. The brain is taking chunks and snipping them into little packets and saying, what is going on? What is going on? What is going on? But when you deal with these top-down things that Peter's so, that's his main study, is now you have this kind of a sorting process where you have an imaginary workspace where all these preconscious operations are now being modeled. And in the long time ago, it was thought that all that would happen is that in these modules, I think this has to do with global workspace theory, is that you just had all these modules and they were preparing data, and the data was being processed, and the brain would either rise or lower the gain on the module, kind of like a microphone or a camera, and it would sort information in that way. But the latest research is showing that this volitional attention is taking information from these preconscious operations and modeling with them, and taking bits and pieces of information and building concepts and ideas. And you're starting to get really close to what would be described as a homunculus, when you have the spotlight sophisticatedly, accessing the preconscious operations in that way. You really aren't, the meat machine starts sounding like it knows that there's something inside of this realm that is basically has a laboratory of information that's constantly being gathered, but it's looking for tools to model a particular thing. It's not just up and down gain, but it's building models. And it's definitely something that in the free will discussion is important, because if you don't have a central questioner using the external world and interpreting it and creating future models for itself, the idea is the itselfness. It's like, where would I be? Where do I want to take this being, and what criteria lies ahead that I can cultivate? And when you were talking about the meta free will, when he talks about meta free will, and I haven't read his libertarian free will paper in years, so I'm going to slaughter this, but with the second order free will, the meta free, it's not just that we can describe that the system is free and operates non-linearly and has this, top down, but that there is a second order situation where it is cultivating freedom, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Like,
we're just kind of choosing what it wants to be, what kind of
yeah, it's
person it wants to be.
if over time, at first somebody, the quasi sui argument is that you are dispossessed of your own decisions because you're a product of nature. So you plop out into the world, you've got the DNA, the environmental and such. But at a certain point, you will have an A and a B decision, and one will present you with a particular criteria. Well, when I say criteria, it'll present you with different ways to think and values that if I go that direction, I'll expose myself to an environment that will give me a different library to choose from. And if I choose the other option, it will present me with a completely different set of values in that library. And I can't have both. I have to navigate to it. And when I get there and along the way, I'll be gathering up criteria. And eventually you start stepping further and further away from what you would call nature, because you're making decisions that would not be a part of your, I was born, so I was born to take up the cello. I was born to study philosophy. I was born to marry this person who was from a different culture. And that person introduced me to different philosophies of mind and religion. There's some things you're not born with. So the cultivation side of it has to do with you start seeking criteria and ways to modify the chooser. So that's his meta free. That's the second order free will, which isn't really I don't really care about the term libertarian. I mean, I think it's overused. I think generally what we want to know is that we are ourselves and our decisions belong to us. And certainly by the time you're wise enough and have made the effort, you start taking ownership of your own decisions.
Right. So would you now? I have a video coming out next week. It's going to be about the Levitt experiments, and you've already watched it because I've already sent it to you to review. But so there's this distinction between arbitrary and deliberate choices. So the deliberate would be the more important aspects, and that would deal with like moral decisions, ethical decisions, um, and basically decisions that have more importance in our life. And so those would be deliberate in the sense that there is no readiness potential that predetermined that choice, but rather there's like this room for someone to have free will in that sense.
Mhm.
And what would be, because I know the researchers, they seem to think that there's different neural mechanisms that go on between those two systems. And so like what would be the neural, I mean, we already understand the neural mechanism for arbitrary choices, which is, you know, the readiness potential. But when it comes to deliberate choices, it seems like we don't yet fully understand how that neural mechanism works, right?
Yeah, there's a good, that's, you know, the thing that the Libet experiment, to somebody who studies free will, now that Mayas 2018 came out, it's like the coolest thing in the world. For the longest time, you'd had Soon, Haggard, and Eimer and Libet all were these weird, mysterious things. And then Mayas 2018 comes out, and it's just startling that we now get to understand how and why that works in such a way. And, it makes perfect sense, a collection effect, for anything that's not super important to not distract this, as Peter C. would talk about, as this volitional attention. Whether you're wanting mayonnaise or ketchup, or if you're going to grab a doorknob with your left or right hand. I mean, come on. The homunculus, if we want to call it, is trying to figure out more philosophical future positions that's going to take itself to. So all of these previous arbitrary tests are described as picking, where you would say see a spinning clock, and you would pick a point that that's where I decided that clock is at that position, and the data would come back that you'd made that decision 250 milliseconds or something
No,
before.
it's actually 10 sec. I mean, the 2008 study said it was 10 seconds before, but
I think that was 50% of the time. I think it was within 50% accuracy, which is not totally dubious. I mean, but that's one of those things where I like it because, I mean, it's still explainable through Mayas,
right,
but I don't think the accuracy was. I don't think it was highly correlated. So that's
right.
that.
So sorry, go on.
But what's really interesting is finally when it's important, something ethical, moral, that AP just flattens out. And that means the homunculus, if I want to call it that, has said, wait, what is this? Is this ketchup or is this my life? And it's like, no, it's your life. You're trying to come up with a charity you want to donate to. So it's so beautiful to finally have this image of the moral, ethical person within us taking
Right,
over the controls of this autopilot and saying,
right,
this,
and
this is fine.
that would be kind of the veto as well. The veto, which
Yeah.
is where, you know, most of the time you're on autopilot, this readiness potential, and then all of a sudden something important comes up, and it's like, all right, the mind is going to take over now.
Yeah. It's, to me, I'm like, when I saw it, I was like, this could be one of the biggest things in free will studies in 10 or 12 years, because for the longest time it was kind of stuck with, I mean, there were postdictions, and there was vetoes, and there was some stuff in some mice that talked about that you may have read this already, about that the decision making kind of can cancel out motoric. And they're all good, but they weren't just so intensely specific to what the conversation was about. So you would in
Right,
one way describe how Libet works using 8 papers, and then you would create this model that would be like, so that's how it works. And then Mayos came along and it's like, no, this is way bigger than that. This is ethical. This is when something is truly important to the person. And think about this, if you talk about the idea of moral desert, which is, a lot of people that are free will skeptics don't believe people should even go to, be punished for their crimes and stuff. This really shows that when, there's a good versus bad, there's a certain amount of deliberation there, that the person is not working on some kind of a reductive system. They can be guilty
right.
of what they do.
So, with that in mind, I mean, if you go on the internet, you look up free will. If you go on YouTube, especially, it's like people just keep on, like they don't look past 28 2008. Like they always just go back to that soon experiment, and then that's like, oh, free will's
Yeah.
dead, and they haven't really looked at the argument against that. And like, why do you think that is? Why do you think there's such like this dogmatic free will skepticism within culture at this moment?
Well, one of its orthodoxy. I would say that in science, there's the eliminativist and the reductionist is very high in science, and I think that there's, I would call teleological tendency to always try to take the agency out of the being. So any kind of anything that skeptic would feel like reduces the agent. Yeah, I mean, to be attracted to the reduction of agency is crazy, epiphenomenalism and all this different stuff. But it is a passionate pursuit. There's also, I mean, maybe it's slow just because of adoption, early adopters and such. There's been a renaissance in memory studies in 2016. So, how long does it take those to work their way through the system? I don't know. There's been so many books and the popularization of, there's Strawson and Harris making really pathetic arguments for free will skepticism. You just have to figure maybe your effort to put this series together or something will allow people to get updated, because free will is a very powerful conversation to be had. And the old, internet troll, free will is impossible.
That's why I'm making this series. I mean, there's only been a few YouTubers that have actually addressed it from a, taken the position that free will does exist. It seems like most of the videos on YouTube are actually against free will.
Oh yeah, I'd say 99%. And even though, here's the thing, the ones that are pro, they're terrible. They're, it's like Sunday school version. I mean, this is a complicated subject, and it would take 6 or 4 or something entries just to get through it. So, good luck, because it's going to be a chore. And I figured it'd take a year to do that. It's going to be a lot of work.
Right. So
maybe you're faster than me.
Right. So my next video is just gonna again be about how free will actually works in the brain, and hopefully I'll see if I could, because I understand it's very new research, so my video is not gonna be filled with citing a bunch of papers, because there's very little we actually know of how free will works in the brain. So I'll try my best to just use Peter Tice's model, or maybe I don't know about Daniel Dennett's model, but
no, I would definitely include Rabinovich's heteroclinic attractors, because he has a recent decision-making paper, and he has winnerless competition, which is very different than what we think of as what computers do in general. So there's some stuff out there that's not really hard to grasp, but that gives us, we got to start thinking of our head as a bunch of sloshy geometry, not this network of circuits. The brain doesn't use circuits to process information. And that's, again, orthodoxy. If you can think, you talk about how is this stuck since 2008? Hodgkin-Huxley-Pitts locked in as the way the brain works must be 50 years ago. And there was a competing electromechanical model that just got, shoved out of, thinking back at the same time. And it recently won out. So I would say that was really bad. Looking at the brain as having circuits really ruined our understanding of free will. Yeah.
Right.
It ruined neuroscience. It ruined our understanding of decision making. It was that is just terrible. And now here we are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even among some, I'm not going to call it names, but even among like some theists, some people have made the argument that the brain works like a computer, and it's like, no, it doesn't. And they're like, oh, what about a quantum computer? Again, no, it doesn't work like a quantum computer. It's much more complicated than that. I mean, you don't have quantum computers that can rewire themselves.
At best, from where I'm at right now, and I'm going to be wrong 10 years from now, and I'll be glad to be wrong. I like being wrong. Is the brain is a bunch of walkie-talkies, and the brain processes information subneurally. Each neuron is a walkie-talkie, and this would explain what Dennett has an issue with. He would call each neuron an ant, and that ant can't communicate with the ant next to it. It can tap it and go, and that's your binary. That's your bit. I touched you, you touched the next. But all those ants can't make a singular conversation together. But what is turning out is, of course, we have subneural processing, and we've known this since Halle Berry, Neuron et al. But there was no understanding of how that information escaped the synaptic as a dendritic tree type thing. So how does their internal information then get turned into this tap? But now if you go about it thinking of the neuron as having two time cycles, one is the firing of the neuron, and that would be like the key on a walkie-talkie. So there's if you think about, I'm holding a walkie-talkie and I have a brain, I have something to say. There's a key on the walkie-talkie that can either be suppressed or allowed to fire, or pressed the key. And now I get to release my information. But the information is not released through the dendritic tree. The information is released emphatically as a frequency coming off of the neuron. And those are called couplings. There's also frequency-dependent nets. So when you think about Hodgkin-Huxley, you have this little circuit board of like on-offs, on-offs, on-offs. Oh, it's so bad. That's totally not the way the brain works. Those are little walkie-talkie keys saying, you think, don't think, you think, don't think. And instead, you now have, if you look at Dennett's argument that these ants can't communicate with each other, if all of the walkie-talkies the brain wants on are on talking together and all the ones are off not talking, you now have a super ant. One ant made of many ants, and that's your homunculus that he hates so much or can't imagine existing. So you could have a billion neurons behaving as one single super neuron because they've been hooked up by a frequency network, a fractal set of frequencies. So that is so new and so different than orthodoxy, and it's been probably established since 2016 that that's where everything's going. That it'll take, as slow as everything goes, it'll take 10 years for general, pop science guys on YouTube to be talking about that.
Right. And do you think that we always talk about like scientific theories, like there's a theory of evolution, there's a theory of quantum mechanics. Do you think there's ever to be an actual theory of the brain?
Yeah. The most exciting studies is they have to go back to slime molds. Because what's funny about a slime mold is, you've heard of like the mind-body problem. A slime mold is a brain, and its brain is its body. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Like if you could take your brain out and put it on a table and it slithered away, all it's got is information processing. It doesn't see, it doesn't know anything. And when you look at these, they did an NP hard test that's so interesting with the slime mold. You could see the different metastable states in the slime mold. It would have a seek, and you could see in these sped up things, the slime mold trying to find this. It was one of those. What is it called? The salesman's. What is it called? It's a test where the salesman has to find the most efficient route. You could see the slime. You could visually see the slime mold testing pathways and then spiraling that information, and then testing pathways and spiraling. You could see metastable states visually as this pulsating, disgusting pile of glop came up with the answer. And that's what our brain is doing. Is it is just this one single organ. It is not divided into these little,
Parts.
Tiny parts. It is this one single gyrating, disgusting slime thing that is seeking and coming up with ideas and combining. And there's even a metastable state that goes across our brain that's a spiral football from one corner to the back, front one side across diagonally. It's so strange when you think about how the brain has some 7 different systems simultaneously just churning going on, and we've reduced it to this pathetic little motherboard. It's way more complicated than that. But yeah, I would say definitely there will be a new thinking, and there will be a theory for how consciousness is prepared in the brain. And then it'll just be up to people to realize that the brain is just not an absolute objective object
Yeah.
in space-time. That's easy because we've already got that, so it'll be an interesting and fascinating next 10 years studying all that.
All right. Well, I think we've pretty much discussed most of everything about free will. So, is there anything else you wanted to add to the discussion, or you just want to end it?
I'm trying to think if there's any. I think what we didn't cover as far as the processing of the determined versus the dependent versus independent is the portion that has to do with future tensing.
Oh, okay. The
When
buffering. Is that
Yeah,
yeah?
the buffering is the preparation of the image, which in all delay experiments, you're going to have a
Buffering. Yeah.
you're going to have a buffer because the brain's going to combine everything and things come in at different times. So you want everything synced up. And then you have even an N400, which is different than the pre. It's kind of a post diction where the brain checks to make sure what it saw it did see, or what it decided to do it got. But the future tensing has to do very much again with this concept of determinism, where we can't just think that, like, the brain is shooting a harpoon out into the future, like you would see a person in a ship and they're navigating this ocean and there's all this interference and competition, but they need to still get to this particular location. They're going sideways, they're hitting a storm, they're doing everything. So you have your environmental, which would be your not letting you get there, and then you have your you have your consciousness, where you know that no matter what you are encountering, you still have your point that you're navigating to. Navigation now has this collaboration between environmental and intent to go somewhere. But I think the confusion usually is that people see that as a single state, that the captain wants to go to the port. But actually, what we need to think of the brain as doing is that between now and the port are going to be several functions, from getting hungry to needing to go to sleep to doubts and changing minds. And that space is now spread to have several different layers of processing. So we don't think of it as a harpoon to the port, and that's the decision. Here we go. There would be millions of these things that are shooting off into the future, tugging at the agent in all different directions as outcomes occur and a person starts doubting that they really want what they chose. So I would hope that when we talk about future tensing of the brain, which is kind of looking down into the future, for instance, when we drive, we don't look at the road in front of us. We look down the road, like, I don't know,
Right. Yeah,
something.
I know. I know that from direct experience.
Eighth of
So
a mile. We don't care what's in front of us. That's too late. We're hitting that. We care what we could possibly hit in the future. Now, this is, of course, again,
right.
escaping Laplacian domain. We're not at T0. Our brain, when we're driving, is at T something forward.
Yeah,
But
I'll get into that. Not that analogy, but I'll explain how there's this buffering in the brain on not my next video, but the video after dealing with the Leibniz experiments.
now the buffer is your representationalism. The buffer is after all the information has come in, it combines, and I was talking about those preconscious operations. It builds a model and says, this is what we saw. Now, it may not be color accurate, shape accurate, time accurate, or anything, but it is what the brain said was important for you to see and know is happening now. The future tensing is not a buffering. It is a looking into the future to say, look, if you make this decision at T0, you're going to end up there. And Dennett uses this. Dennett talks about, because he likes a kind of a compatibilist view,
Yeah.
where when animals have the ability to say, if there is a spear coming at my head at this angle and I need to go either to the left or the right, now you have an animal breaking Laplacian's domain also. You have an animal making the decision about something that's going to happen in the future If you stand still, you will be hit with the spear. If you move left or right, you have now changed the course of history. So those things are future tensing. That's where you say, if I don't make a decision, this is my future. If I do make a decision, this is my future. That's future tensing. So that's not a buffer. That's on the other end of it.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean that would be more intuitive with how we make decisions, you know.
Yeah, and there's a really
think,
cool. I'm sorry. There's a really cool Quanta magazine article about future tensing. It's got some pink goldfish on it. I'll send you that. That's a really great article.
Yeah, because I'll just kind of briefly explain that, and then hopefully I can once I do that video, then I'll just probably just explain those two models you mentioned to me, and just again, I want to make the point that, you know, free will in neuroscience is very new, so there's not much research into it with regards to exactly how free will works in the brain, but we know it exists. It's just we kind of figure out how it works, and so.
Yeah, I would think in 20 years you won't have all this free will skepticism. It won't be libertarian. Maybe it'll be this very nuanced model where people, you know, when you ask, do you have free will? You have to say, well, it's kind of complicated,
Right.
instead of no.
Right. So, all right. Well, thanks for coming on, and yeah.
All right, we're looking forward to this series, man.
Yeah.
Go for it.
All right.
You do all the heavy lifting. We'll listen.
I will. Don't worry. All right. I'm gonna close this podcast.
All right.